for Zooming in tonight. Make sure you have your snacks ready, that you're comfortable. Woohoo, I see snacks, I see wine glasses. This is going to be awesome. Awesome, awesome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have a couple more people who are joining. We are recording tonight, so if you do not want your likeness recorded, you can turn off your video. While we're waiting to get started, if you would use the chat, we're going to be using the chat for Q&A and all that good stuff, or for questions at least. If you would use the chat just to let us know where you are Zooming from. So just give us your location in the chat. It's like we got Dayton, we got Minneapolis, we got Pittsburgh. Oh, I love Pittsburgh. It's one of my favorite cities to visit. Hey, that's Pittsburgh. Lots of Black history, lots of amazing history in Pittsburgh. Pleasant Ridge, Indiana, Cincinnati, Rolling Meadows, Illinois, Mainsville, Mount Washington, Ludlow. Lots of Pleasant Ridge, it's our neighbors. Michigan, Austin, Texas, College Hill, that's my neighbor. I'm in North College Hill. Dayton, Boston, Covington. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I do see some familiar faces. I also see some new faces. So if you've been to one of these sessions before, this is you've heard this spiel. You could probably do it if you've been to most of the sessions. But if you're new, just briefly who I am, why we do this, how this is going to work, and then we'll get started. My name is Reverend Derek Terry. I am the pastor of St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the Pleasant Ridge neighborhood. I've been there about 7-8 years. And our church is completely diverse. It's Black, it's white, it's young, it's a little older than young, it's Republican, it's Democrat, it's really, 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 we have really, really, really progressive liberal members, we have conservative, we have straight members, we have gay members. We're literally a nice little diverse box of church. And so a couple years ago, after the election in 2016, we were finding ourselves, what in the world can we do? Half of my church was devastated about the way the election went. The other half, their guy was elected. But there were all these ideas around race and identity that were swimming around the air, but no one was talking about. And so as a pastor, I thought, well, that's what I have to do. We have to talk about the stuff that needs to be talked about, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it's upsetting. And we needed to create a place. We needed to be brave enough to create a place to have these conversations. And so we started having conversations on racism and social justice. And so we've been doing this consistently since then. We've looked at movies like James Baldwin's I Am Not Your Negro. We've studied books from the past in the 19th century, books, new books. We've compared W.E.B. Du Bois to Malcolm X, and just really taken a lot of time to look at our country's history on race and how we've gotten it wrong and what we can do to fix it. And so if you come to something like this, you have to understand that we don't consider these sessions our opportunity to try to convince you that racism exists. We think that if you come here, that you believe at some level racism is there, and we just want to help you to understand how it functions, what it looks like. There may be ways that you may be supporting racism that you don't even understand, that you may not even be aware of. And so our goal is to help people to identify uh, systems of racism and oppression so that we can dismantle and tear them down. The exciting work today, and here's a big part of why I do this, because a lot of my Black friends feel it is not my job to teach white people about racism and social justice and being anti-racist. That's what a lot of my Black friends say. And being that I'm the pastor of a church that's half Black and half white, I feel like maybe this is my calling, because someone has to talk to people who may not understand, who may not know. And we can't get upset when people get it wrong if we're not helping them to get it right. So that's what we're doing this. So today, we're looking at some of the concepts from the book White Fragility. And we have, and the interesting part about White Fragility is that it is a white writer who is specifically writing to white people about whiteness, the social construct of whiteness, and what it means to be white in this country. There's something that Black people have to do each and every day, all day long, in most of our spaces, anytime we're in a space without um, anytime we're in a space where it's not just Black people. And that's gauging our Blackness and checking how we enter the room, what people see when we enter the room, how much space we take up. If you have Black friends, they'll tell you. Anywhere we go, a lot of us will be able to tell you how many Black people were in the room. It's just that's just something that we do, and we're gauging that. When I go shopping, I'm tall, 6'5", well over 200 pounds. I'm always gauging, how do people receive me when I'm in the space? And not just physically, but how do they receive me, when we're interacting? How are they looking? What is their energy? And why do I do that? It's a safety thing, right? It's also a comfort thing. If I go to a store and I don't feel comfortable, if I don't feel welcome, if I don't get that vibe, I won't go back there. So it's also, it's an economic, it's a social thing. And unfortunately, because of the way whiteness in our country is set up as the standard, as the ideal, as the optimum, that's not always the case with my white counterparts. And so I'm used my whole entire life, the schools that I went to, the classes that I went to, I was used to being one of the only Black people in the room, and knowing how to navigate that, knowing how to navigate my Blackness. And so White Fragility is really a call for white people to check in on their whiteness, and what is my whiteness doing? Why is this important? And so our three presenters today are three white people who have been doing the work, the anti-racist work of checking their own whiteness in their particular fields, but then also helping to extend the cause of anti-racism in this country. And it's important. I got some flack from some of my Black friends. How can you have three white people talking about anti-racism? But guess what? It's going to take each and every one of us, all of us, to use our gifts, our talents, and our intellect to take down a system that has been so thoroughly built in this country. This country was built on the oppression and marginalization of non-rich white people, especially white men. And so it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to do the work of dismantling these systems to create a better country for all of us. Racism is not just a Black problem. It's an American problem. It hurts each and every one of us. And so we have three different presentations. They're going to go through 10 minutes around 10 minutes each. Then we'll have questions and feedback. We'll use the chat so that, because it's about 80 of us online right now. And so it's really easy for us to use the chat to ask any questions that you might have. This is a safe place to get it wrong. So don't think, oh, I can't ask that because I may not use the right words, or it may make it seem like I'm racist. Now understand, if you get it wrong, we will correct you, but we won't scold you. We won't attack you. But it's a safe place for you to ask those questions. We're so excited that you are here. And we're going to start with David Owen. He's going to introduce himself to us. And so, yeah, I'll turn it over now to David.
Thank you, Reverend Terry. I really appreciate the invitation to join this discussion today. I'll try to keep this brief because I think the richest part of the event will be in the Q&A and the discussion that we have. My name is David Owen. I'm interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Louisville. I'm a philosopher by training, and my more recent work has been in philosophy of race, whiteness, particularly interested in how whiteness sustains this system of white supremacy that we live in, that we'll all be talking about today. I did spend, prior to serving as dean, and I was department chair of the philosophy department for a bit, I spent 10 years as director of diversity programs for the College of Arts and Sciences. So I've been immersed in anti-racist work. I see diversity as more than just celebrating difference, but in terms of equity and doing real anti-racist and anti-oppressive work. So that's a little bit of my background. Let me talk a little bit about how race shapes the lives of white people. And I'm going to speak particularly from sort of the first person perspective, from how it's experienced and how I see the world as a white person, what that means a little bit. And I think the overall theme is the world is my home, right? That's how I experience the world. It was literally, the world has been constructed to meet my needs and my interests as a white person. And so, and we'll go through some of those details here in a minute. But the world is my home, it's made for me. And so what does that mean? It means that I feel at home every day. I don't feel alienated, right? My race isn't something that I'm conscious of. Being white is not something I'm conscious of. In fact, white folks, as most of you know, are really self-conscious if we identify ourselves as white or talk about whiteness or what it means to be white, because whiteness is the norm, right? And so it's the unspoken norm. And when we often talk about race, I teach about this in my classes frequently, right? When we talk about race, the discourse around race in the US is almost always defaults to, well, we're talking about people of color, in particular, Black people, right? Very rarely do our discussions around race include white people. They do increasingly frequently now, which is encouraging, and in contexts like this. But the general discourse really sort of centers white people, our interests, and our needs. So what that means then is that race is not a central conscious part of my identity. I don't think of myself as a white person. There's a great clip in Mirrors of Privilege, a great documentary about whiteness and white privilege. And a white woman in there says she was at a workshop once, and she says, she heard the Black presenter say, every morning I wake up and think I'm a Black woman in this world. And the white woman who's recounting the story says, that's interesting. What would that be like? Because I don't wake up every morning thinking I'm white, right? I'm not reminded, as I go through the world, I'm not reminded, well, I'm reminded of my whiteness because I see it reflected back, but that's sort of at the unconscious level, right? I don't have to consciously think about it. In fact, I think of myself as raceless most of the time. I don't think of myself as even having a race, right? And that's the popular discourse. I don't think I'm unique here. Now, doing work in this area, I think of my whiteness a little bit more frequently, but a big part of the day, because the world reflects myself back to me. I don't have to think about my racial whiteness. Um, and when I go through the world, when I just move through the world, it's constructed for me. So my whiteness does not count against me. In fact, it works in my favor in many instances. So just a real trivial example, but it's pretty stark. I was in a small fender bender near the university a few years ago, um, uh, and the police officers came and they were just taking the report. There were no injuries or anything. It was pretty minor. And as part of that, you give them your insurance cards and your driver's license. And when the white police officer handed me back the insurance card, he said, "Just remember to put your updated insurance card in your car." Right. And so uh, I had handed him an outdated insurance card. He didn't know if I had insurance or not. Right. But he gave me the benefit of the doubt in that situation. It was, he was doing me a favor, right, in his eyes, right? Just make sure you put the updated insurance cards in there. He assumed I had valid insurance. And being white works to my benefit in a lot of ways. In my particular case, when I talk about race, actually, I teach courses in the philosophy of race. And when I walk into the classroom, first of all, students aren't typically expecting a white professor to walk in to be lecturing about race. But then when I do talk about race, as a white male, I'm seen as the embodiment of knowledge in the academy, right? And so I'm seen as having legitimate authority, and I'm not seen as speaking in my own self-interest when I'm talking about race. So my Black colleagues, when they're talking about race, right, students will discount the legitimacy of what they're saying because they're Black, and they'll say, well, they're just trying to work the system, right? They're trying to get ahead, and they're working in their own self-interest. So I don't experience that. I'm seen as just a person, right? When I walk into the classroom or when I move through the world, I'm not seen as a member of a racialized group. I'm individualized. And so when I make a mistake or I'm late to a meeting, it's just me being late, not me as a representative of all white people that's doing this behavior. There's really interesting studies that equate being white and white racial identity with being American and American identity, right? And those are equated and conflated quite frequently. And there's good studies. There was a study. This is now 15 years ago, I suppose, maybe 12 years ago, that they did a survey, and Tony Blair, who's Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, was seen as being more American than Barack Obama, right? Because he was white and Barack Obama was Black. And so, in hindsight, we can see all of the racism that accompanied the rise of Barack Obama to the presidency. So another aspect of whiteness that we experience, and this is often very unconsciously, but if you start paying attention, you see it quite frequently, and that is what our author talks about as white solidarity, right? This is white racial bonding, and it's grounded in actually I've worked with Charles Mills, who's written The Racial Contract. He's cited in the book, and his account of race, this notion of the racial contract, states that white people have come to a conscious and unconscious agreement, explicit and implicit agreement, to oppress people of color systematically. And so what this means is that we engage in this white racial bonding in really subtle ways, right? We'll hear a snide racial comment or a joke that we find slightly offensive, but we don't call it out because we don't want to break rank. We want to seem like a team player. We don't want to be singled out as different, right? We want to, white people find ourselves feeling the need, this sort of implicit pressure to stick together, right, when it comes to race. And so there's this constant pressure to not challenge each other when it comes to race because of our common racial identity. And this is how the system of white supremacy gets reproduced through these everyday actions, these little actions, right? Little behaviors. It's not, and I think that's what's really critical. So how, I was going to start this off by saying I'm David Owen and I'm a racist. But I don't like the term racist because it too frequently individualizes the problem, right? I prefer to talk about systemic racial oppression. Well, I was socialized into this system that is inherently white supremacist, right? And so and that system gets reproduced through our behaviors and our practices and our actions every day, all of us, right? And so what am I doing? I have to ask myself frequently, right? I mean, constantly, what am I doing to reproduce that system, or how am I acting to counter it and dismantle it? Because if I just don't pay attention and I just go through my life, I'm implicitly reproducing that system. And that's how that system, where it gets its power and how it is sustained. Um, what this also means is that racial progress is resisted. I think the racial system, sort of defends itself, and so white folks are always put on edge, and we see this in the discourse all of the time. Put on edge by racial progress, and in fact, "Make America Great Again" is the theme for this, right? Make it great when, right? And people have asked this. I'm not saying anything new, right? That in the 50s, when racial segregation was explicit, and discrimination was permitted, in the 19th century, when we had both slavery and then Reconstruction and lynchings and everything else that maintain the racial order, the white supremacist racial order. So there's this constant resistance to racial progress and wanting to get back to the good old days, and this push to colorblindness, right? This is how another way the racial system gets maintained is, I'm not supposed to see race. Why do you pay attention? If we don't look at race, if we don't attend to it, if we don't pay attention to it, then everything is just fine. Well, that's just another way of reproducing the system, because it's not an equitable playing field as we stand. And so if we just stop paying attention to that, when I lived in California in the 90s, and I forget what the proposition was at the time, the number, but they passed a proposition in the state that banned law enforcement from collecting racial data from stops. Well, all that does is prevent us from seeing if there's any racial disparity in law enforcement practices, right? Doesn't mean it's not happening. We're just stopped looking for it, right? Another aspect of experiencing race as a white person is this implicit need, and we get socialized to believe in our innocence, right? As white people, most of us, and I suspect most of the people on this call are white progressives, right? And we believe we're trying to do the right thing. We believe in our moral goodness. We want other people to see us as morally good. I'm trying to do the right thing, and I have this implicit innocence, right? And if I do get called out on something, what happens? The defense is, well, I didn't intend it that way, right? But what we ignore is the impact, and that's what's crucial. What's the impact of what I'm doing? Jay Smooth has this great bit. There's a YouTube video on this, and he says, we too often talk about, is he racist or is he, not racist? When somebody does something obviously racist, there'll be a debate in the public sphere about whether that person's really racist, and somebody will come out, a friend of his, and say, I know this person really well, and I know they're not racist in any way. And Jay Smooth says, that's the entirely wrong question, because I don't know what's in your heart, right? We can't prove that. That's a way to skirt the whole problem. What's really important is what that person did, right? And he says, he gives this great example, if a pickpocket grabs your wallet and runs down the street, you chase after him and grab him, you're not going to worry about whether he's a pickpocket at heart, right? Are you really a pickpocket? It's what he did that really concerns you. And that, I think, is really instructive and something we need to pay attention to. And finally, my experience as a white person, from my perspective, is seen to be universal because I'm at home in the world, right? And so I'm at home, the world has been constructed to serve my needs and interests, and we can go into specific details about that around the law, the built structure, employment system, and education system, and politics, and so on. But I see the world through particular perspective, and racially, at least, right? I think everybody ought to see it that way, right? And I have a hard time as a white person seeing it from a different racialized perspective. And so I see my experience is universalized. And this goes back to the color. This is what really underlies the colorblind ideology, right? It's like, well, if this is how I see the world, why don't you see it that way? You must see it this way. How could I be wrong about this? And so I think that's another way that whiteness and so the system of white supremacy gets sustained, because white people are not supposed to recognize our own whiteness and our own our particular perspective on the world. So I think I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we'll have a lively Q&A in a few minutes.
Clapping, clapping, clapping.
Awesome,
Thanks,
awesome. Thank you so much, David. So people are putting some comments in the comment section, definitely, and we're going to address some of those after everyone else has had a chance to present. Kate is now sharing her screen because she's next, and I believe it's racial triggers for white people. I'll go ahead and let Kate do her thing.
Thanks, Derek. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate McCracken. I live locally to many of you in Pleasant Ridge, Cincinnati. And for those of you who have been on these calls regularly, I have been Derek's Zoom helper. But maybe as you've also picked up on my inability to withhold my own advice giving in the chat, I also do this work in the world, both full-time for an education nonprofit and as a consultant, doing things like leadership development and training and organizational culture consultation. And my work has always been grounded in the concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. It's interesting still for me to be introduced as a white person, because for a long time I did not identify with my white identity. And I think that's largely because I wanted to distance myself from whiteness and the problems that went along with it. My mother is the child of Mexican and Hungarian immigrants, so I had enough proximity to brownness to identify as Mexican and have a little pass for my whiteness. I'm a queer person in a relationship with a woman, although your relationship status and your sexual identity are not the same thing. And so queerness was another distancing from whiteness. I live in a fat body, which is another distancing from a normative or dominant identity experience. But in the past 20 years of doing this work and looking at myself as an entry point into the work, I have to and have chosen to see my white identity in all the ways that David mentioned is not automatic, because without awareness of that, I can't get into the work. I want to start today beyond my introduction with a little bit of a story about what it was like to prepare for this time. Derek asked the three of us to speak, and he asked us each to cover the topic that we were planning to cover. Oh shoot, I forgot to put my thing in presentation mode. Don't look at all the surprises that are coming next. Anyway, so Derek asked me to do the topic of racial triggers, and then I asked him what the other two topics were because I didn't want to overlap too much. And this is an image of what I saw in my inbox when I got his email back. So here's the subject line of the email, and then this is his language to me. Do you have racial triggers? And then he says the other two are this and this and this. And I kid you not, my immediate reaction was, you have racial triggers, Derek. I was observing myself as I had this moment going, wow, talk about white fragility. What just happened in your body, Kate? And of course, first I went into a shame spiral, as many of us often do. Why am I being asked to have this conversation when I can't even handle reading a sentence that was certainly not meant as an attack? And then I remembered that the story would probably be more valuable than anything else I would have to share because it's real. The work is real and the work is ongoing. So for this idea of racial triggers, David spoke to this a lot, and so I'm going to fly through this next part. But we have racial triggers as white folks because of the beliefs that we've been socialized with. So like everyone else has already said, I see there are some people on this call who likely don't identify as white folks, who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. I'm talking to white people here, and I'm also eager to hear what others folks hear, because whiteness is not just something that impacts white people by any means. It's a pretty dominant American concept. But as white people, we have been socialized, likely, to believe that objectivity exists, that race is a taboo topic we're not supposed to talk about, that we are entitled to our own comfort, including at the expense of others' expression, and particularly others who are don't have the same identities as we do, that Black, Indigenous, or people of color, if you've seen this acronym BIPOC, that's what it means, are expected to be in roles of service to us or to serve us, that we expect solidarity among other white people. David talked about this one a fair bit. I'm going to close the chat windows and get them out of my way. That you're innocent, that you didn't mean to, that you didn't do it, so it couldn't be hurtful. That you are an individual and should be considered as an individual separate from any group. That we live in a meritocracy where everyone gets what they earn or deserve. That your whiteness gives you some measure of authority. That your experience, like David said, is typical, it's neutral, it's the default, your identity is neutral. And this one's mine. The others are the rewording of what's in the book. This one's mine. That whiteness teaches us that there is such a thing as an absolute right and wrong, and that those absolutes are trustworthy. Now, what this results in is racial stress when things push up against those beliefs that we're socialized with, right? So we experience a racial stress or a racial trigger when we hear someone else say that our viewpoint is racial. So they say, that's because you're a white person, or that's because of whiteness. And we get all flustered. When specifically Black, Indigenous, or people of color's views on race are different from ours. When people, again, specifically Black, Indigenous, or people of color, choose not to protect your comfort as a white person over their own expression. When people are unwilling to share their experiences or stories, Derek talks about this a lot, how he's willing to, but he certainly doesn't have to, right? People get to choose here. When other white folks don't honor that solidarity and align with your perspectives. When you learn that your behavior had a racist impact, whether that was your intention or not. When someone names experience in a group as significant rather than just being seen as that individual we talked about before. When it is named that there is access inequities, meaning you don't just get what you deserve or you earn, you get what you have access to and what choices are made available to you. When Black, Indigenous, and people of color are in positions of leadership. And when Black, Indigenous, or people of color act or are portrayed, whether this is in real life or in media, in non-stereotypical roles. And then again, my addition, you make a mistake or realize that you have more to learn. And I'll be completely frank here again, when I first read through this list of racial triggers, which is in the book, and then you can find it's kind of a table online that marries them with those beliefs and socialization factors that I mentioned in the last slide. I had a hard time relating to some of them, which is why I rewrote them. The language in the book is pretty academic. But I think it's really easy, especially if you've been doing this work for a while as a white person, but certainly in the starting place, to get attached to that identity of the good white person, the good white anti-racist, and start to believe that these things are no longer an issue for you. Maybe you can name an uncle who acts this way or gets triggered by these things, or maybe you can think about times from the past that you could relate to these things, but how do they come into play? today. The story that I told you in the beginning about my reaction to Derek's email, I'm not 100% sure I can tell you exactly which one of these categories that it fit into, but I can tell you that it made me realize that I have more work to do. And then what that drives me to do is respond to a racial trigger, right? So a lot of times we respond with defensiveness. That's how I responded. And by the way, this is a thing for me, even when it doesn't have to do with race. That's my like number one combat. No, you, blah, 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 blah. So we respond with defensiveness. We might become argumentative. Sometimes people get violent, physically, emotionally. Some people also shut down or disassociate and may not appear violent, but it's that kind of withdrawal, And again, it becomes really easy to associate these kind of responses to racial triggers with white supremacists, with white nationalists, with people who are actively spreading hate rather than those of us, all of us, who have been socialized to be a part of the systemic racist system. Other ways that we respond, and these are more the ways that I do, the urge to do something. So, okay, I just had this moment of trigger. I've got to fix it. I've got to make this uncomfortable feeling go away. I must do something. What's that something going to be? Who can I donate money to? Wanting to get it right so I don't have to have this uncomfortable feeling again next time. Expecting to be able to figure it out so that at some point I won't have these uncomfortable experiences anymore, and then I can teach other people how not to and save the world by protecting my white comfort. And lastly, the thing that I think I see the most is turning our focus to everyone else but ourselves. Often when confronted with our own racial triggers as white folks, we just want to tell every other white person what we've learned about how to do it right, and don't deepen our own work here. And as a result, maybe we get this "congratulations, you're a good white person" certificate that I found in Google Images today when I was getting ready. But ultimately, what I would like to invite and consider is that racial triggers are an invitation to something, not something to do, not "I've gotten triggered, so let me figure out what to do," but rather how to be, how to distance myself from my whiteness because I am choosing new beliefs, mindsets, ways of being, behaviors, and habits that change the impact my whiteness has on the people that I have relationships with, while still accepting responsibility for the ways that my whiteness has been a part of this entire system of oppression and violence and ongoing damage. By the way, for those of you who've been around a couple sessions, my email and phone number are on here, and we'll share the slides, or I'll put it in the chat as well, because I offered to reach out to a bunch of people a couple sessions ago, and then, as you know, forgot to save the chat. So if anyone had been wanting to get in touch with me, I'll put my info in the chat as well. And I'm done for now, and I'm looking forward to Q&A also. So I will pass it back to Derek to transition to Phil.
That was awesome, Kate. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love that. I took a picture of that slide from from what to do to how to be. So I think that's what we're all trying to do, is we want to be good people, not just do the right thing. So last but not least is one of the awesome members of my awesome church, who does a lot of really good work, who has a beautiful family and a new baby, and he is on tonight. I guess she's 4 months old? Did I get it right?
Just 5 months old.
5 months old. So we're excited that the 5-month-old is loaning us her dad tonight. So we'll let Phil take it from here.
It's more like Catherine is loaning you her husband.
Okay.
Okay. Let's start here.
Is that your mother-in-law on the line? Ooh, you got
And
mother-in-law.
my mother and my father.
Your mother and father on there too. Oh wow! So you got to do well. No pressure.
No pressure. Oops. There we go. Sorry, the drop-down menu for Zoom is getting in the way of me being able to start my slideshow. There we go. Okay, so Derek asked me to present on this particular chapter, White Fragility in Action. And what I'm kind of realizing, having listened to Kate's awesome presentation, is that I need to go back to the book, because my presentation is really similar to Kate's in its content, almost weirdly so, just presented a little bit differently. So I don't know if that means the chapters are really redundant with each other, or what's going on there, but a little bit of reinforcing and seeing things in a different way isn't such a bad thing. So I am a assistant professor at Miami University here in Ohio, and I teach in our public health program. So I'm a public health professor and practitioner in terms of I do work with community organizations and coalitions and a researcher, and my work focuses on health disparities. So what I mean by that is what we're seeing, for example, with COVID-19 and the extraordinary disproportionality of deaths among African Americans for COVID-19. We study, why are these things going on? And we think about why are these things going on? And obviously it's not just COVID-19 where that's the case. The other major part of my work, which shows up in my research, but it's also just a lot of what I spend my time on, is thinking about academia and our institutions and universities and our research organizations and what we do to perpetuate white supremacy, white male supremacy, and health disparities. I gave a talk and a webinar earlier today on exactly that topic, how our research one of the research organizations that I belong to, I'm a professional membership with, is perpetuating health disparities through white male supremacy. So, and similar to David, I've been involved in committees on diversity, inclusion, all that kind of stuff in multiple universities. I haven't been doing this work for decades, so I'm a little bit different. When it comes to privilege, I check all the boxes. I was in a workshop once, one of the first workshops I went to in terms of race and understanding race and racism. And they did an activity where they put up this slide showing advantages and disadvantages. And these were long lists. And the entire point of the slide was everybody's got both, right? You have some advantages, some disadvantages. This has to do with this idea of intersectionality. And I'm sitting there shrinking in my chair like, nope, I'm all of those advantages. So I come from a place of as intersecting privilege as you can think of in a lot of ways. But I did a hard stop and a hard pivot in terms of getting involved in this work when I took a job in the City University of New York, right in the middle of a racial crisis. And so was thrown into a situation of thinking about race and my whiteness very quickly. And so in the last 6 years have had a huge steep learning curve and try not to look back too much. So that's a little bit about me. So there are different types of white fragility in action and how this actually looks and plays out in life. And that's what this chapter is about. One of them specifically, one of the ways this plays out, I'm going to call this pattern. And these are patterns. And that's what the author, Robin DiAngelo, talks about, how this stuff just, you see it, you start to see it all the time presenting in similar ways. And so here's what we've got here is step one in this pattern. So a conversation about race or racism ensues. And on the left here, we have a white person. On the right, we have another person, maybe white, maybe not, maybe a person of color. And these conversations happen in workshops or trainings, at the dinner table, at work, with colleagues or coworkers, on Facebook, on the bus, going for a walk. Two people, two or more people, wherever conversations about race and racism might happen. And the white person, we can see, has these assumptions that Kate was talking about. I don't see your race, like almost repeating them to themselves in their minds, like, I don't see your race, I don't see your race, I don't see your race. And then the other person is coming in here saying, I do see your race, I see my race. So different assumptions and perspectives being brought into the conversation. And Kate went through a bunch of these types of assumptions, and David touched on them as well. And these are just some of them, right? And we don't necessarily have all of them, but these are the kinds of ways that they show up. Only bad people are racist. Only bad people are white supremacists. I'm not a bad person, therefore I'm not racist or white supremacist. I do not see color. I know everything I need to know already. Racism's not my responsibility. I have friends of color, so I can't be racist. I don't have biases or prejudices. Nothing I say or do is racist. Racism is a thing of the past. This other person is coming into this conversation with their assumptions and perspectives. Racism is systemic. It's a structural issue. It's a policy problem. And same with white supremacy. Doing nothing is the same thing as being complicit in promoting a racism status quo in our system structures and policies. The perspective that everyone is biased, and white people tend to be anti-Black biased, and that, I'm sorry, but my video, there we go. White people do racist or anti-racist things. This is brought to light most recently by Ibram X. Kendi, but it's an old idea that you're doing racist things or you're doing anti-racist things, and there's no really just stepping out of it. And so these are clearly different perspectives and assumptions. And one of the important things that David was talking about is that the assumptions on the left here perpetuate the problems on the right. And the book, White Fragility, talks about this. Lots of other books talk about this. These are old ideas. And so it's not the focus of this chapter. I'm not going to get into it, but if that's a stopping point where you're thinking, I haven't really thought about that, or I disagree with that, this is where a lot of conversation and education and thinking really needs to happen about how those assumptions perpetuate these problems. So just a more little background, what is typically the case in this scenario is that the person on the left, this white person, is often, not always at all, but is often someone who's had very limited conversations with people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color about racism, have never or barely picked up a book about racism, watched a documentary, listened to a podcast, etc., living in a predominantly white community, working with in a predominantly white setting. Whereas the other person is often somebody who often is a person of color who's experiencing systemic racism, or is a white person who's committed hours, days, months, years, decades, like our other presenters, reading, acting, conversing with people of color about racism, learning history, and thinking about white privilege. So step 2 here, conversation ensues, white person says something based on their assumptions. If everyone stopped talking about race, all the problems would go away. One thing I'm going to say is that every example that I'm using here is something that I have said, experienced, or witnessed, but these are also things that are in the book in terms of direct quotes and summarizing situations. And it's because of the idea that this is a pattern, that these ideas and assumptions are old and universal. So that's one example. I'm not racist. I have never done anything that's racist. I have Black friends. All lives matter. Just get rid of the bad cops, bad racist cops. I didn't know it's offensive to touch a Black woman's hair. Give me a break. I didn't intend to do something that was harmful. This Black person did this bad thing. Did I mention that he, she was Black? He, she, they was Black. I am Italian, Irish, Polish, Jewish, LGBTQ plus, a woman. So I get it. I get what it's like to be Black. I understand. You're protesting wrong. He doesn't have a birth certificate. So those are examples from real life. And then the other person will come in and say, listen, David mentioned this. It's not the intention, it's the impact. Doesn't matter what your intention was. I'm happy that you're a good person and that you mean to do well, but when you have a racist impact, that's what really matters. And when you contribute to racism, that's what really matters. It's that impact. White people can't help playing a role in racism. We're born into it. We don't have a choice about that. It's not fair, but it's not fair for anybody. It's particularly not fair for people on the receiving end of oppression. So either you're helping or you're hurting. And it's the choice we have. If we just ignore color, nothing's going to change. So sure, you have Black friends, but have you ever had a conversation with them about what it's like to be Black? So challenging the assumptions And here, you know what? I hear you saying this. There's been a lot of work in this area. Maybe you could take a look at this particular book or this documentary or this podcast. And then the next step is the white person experiences some strong emotions. This conversation's making me really uncomfortable. I don't like what you're saying about me. The white person might feel very strong sadness. I didn't realize that I was creating these problems, or how did I not know this about my life, my society? Maybe there is some crying involved. There's a chapter in White Fragility, called White Women's Tears. And that's not me as a man picking on women, because at least women are emotionally involved enough to be crying. The white person gets very angry. I'm not racist. How dare you? I have more black friends than you do. That's a direct quote from not that long ago that I was subject to. You think you know everything. You think you're so smart. And then step 5 is trying to de-escalate. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. Can we keep the conversation going? Or often this gets put on people of color, consoling. They're there. You aren't a bad person. They're there. You know, coming to the white person's comfort. Or the white person leaves, says, you know what, this is BS. I'm done. You're gonna sit here and tell me I'm racist. I'm fragile. I'm out. To summarize step 5, what this does is the white person is the center of attention. Right? It takes the conversation, it takes the focus off the problem, systemic racism, experiences of people of color, and it puts it right on the white person as the center of attention. And it stops often, not always, but often it stops the conversation. It can stop the conversation. And so the learning stops. So what happens then when the conversation stops? There's a myth that you can just kind of separate yourself from this stuff. But when we live in an unjust society, justice needs to happen. Like, injustice, of course, is a problem. And people recognize that. So when you step out of the work as a white person, all you're doing is putting it on other people. You're putting it on your kids, your grandkids, who are going to have to do the work. We have to do the work. We have to get to keep working towards a point of justice. So when you're not doing the work, other people are doing it. And with less people working for change, the work is harder and the work is more dangerous, especially for people of color who are doing the work. So this is the impact. And the book talks about the impact of white fragility. And of course, then it takes justice longer to achieve. More people get hurt, more people die. The last sentence in the chapter is in summary, the prevailing white racial assumptions and the behaviors they engender protect racism. And that is this part, is that those assumptions perpetuate the problems. That's not the only pattern. There's other patterns, and Kate mentioned these. And so there's working, the work gets too hard and emotional. So a white person says, you know what, I need a break. I got to step out of this. I don't know if I can do this anymore. The book gives an example of somebody who was working with indigenous populations and kept saying that to the indigenous people, and the result being them consoling them, be like, oh, you can do it. It's okay. White person doesn't want to break away from white solidarity. David talked about white solidarity. And what happens there is it doesn't challenge the status quo. And Kate mentioned focusing more on what other people are doing than what we're doing. So calling other people out, reposting stuff on Facebook, identifying problems in society, and spending all of our time doing that instead of examining what it is that we're doing that is or not doing that's being complicit in perpetuating our systems of racism. And again, you know, work falls on others and justice takes longer. And the thing is, like, I'm standing here talking as, like I said, a white man who's experienced many many types of privilege in my life. And of course, when I do this work, this happens to all of us. Kate gave an example from today. We experience discomfort or strong negative emotions when we learn about racism and our sexism, whatever it is, and our role in it. I got called out on as a professor on being more likely to call on white male students. And of course that I felt discomfort when I heard that. And then I brought it up in a workshop a couple of years later and talked about how I responded to it. And I got called out on how I responded to it was problematic. And then I was like, oh, you know, that really, of course, that doesn't feel good. We experience fatigue when we do the work. When I was working in CUNY, I absolutely said things to my wife like, this is really hard. You know, I need a break from this. I don't know if I can keep going on with doing my work and juggling this. And of course, that's my privilege speaking, and some people don't have a choice. We avoid confrontations with other white people when they're doing things that are problematic. So this is the white solidarity problem. And that is particularly my anti-racist Achilles heel. I like to be liked, especially by my neighbors and friends, and I shy away from confrontation. My wife and I were on a walk not that long ago, and a neighbor had his car ran into and stopped the car, you know, saw it happen and said, you know, and it was these black kids, and called out the race. And I walked away with my wife and I was like, that was racist. But why didn't I say, what does them being black have to do with it? You know, and have the conversation. And so these are just examples, focusing more on what other people are doing than what we're doing is a trap that is really easy to fall into. So it happens to all of us. And so the question is, what do we do when it happens? And I think Kate provided a great answer to that. And that's an important place to be having a conversation. You know, do we walk away, or do we learn and grow and increase our stamina and get back into it? So being the last presenter, I'm going to turn things back over to Derek, I think, to have some comments and questions and whatnot.
So we're going to give all of our presenters a sign language applause. This is not easy to do this type of work at this time, because you have to be vulnerable, right? Even when you're just creating a 10-minute presentation. So I really, really, really appreciate all of you for doing that. If you have any questions or comments, please, please, please use the chat box so that we can address those things. There was just one thing that I have to say at every single session, and Phil's presentation brought it up, and that is what do we actually do, right? That's the question I get the most from white people, is what do I do? And I get, you know, should I read this book first or that book first? Or have you seen this TED Talk, or should I do this? Or, you know, I've been to all these sessions. And so what do I do? And the beautiful answer that I give is you do the work. You read the books, you go where Black people are. If it's important for you to side with, if it's important to you to be on the right side against racism, it's not just reading the books and coming to these sessions. It really is being uncomfortable. I just put in the chat, like, that discomfort that so many people avoid. I have church members that when we started doing this work came up to me, little old white ladies. It makes me uncomfortable when you talk about race. And I'm like, girl, how do you think I feel? It's you have to, that's part of it. If you are really on the right side of this thing, which is next to the marginalized and oppressed populations, if you're saying this is wrong, it's not just enough to say this is wrong. It's being uncomfortable too. There were white people who were abolitionists, and that was scary and that was uncomfortable. And there were white people who fought during the modern civil rights movement, and that was scary and that was uncomfortable. And that's what it takes. If it takes being uncomfortable. It also takes being strategic in what you can do. I always say being anti-racist doesn't mean yelling at your racist uncle at Thanksgiving, right? That's not going to change the systems of racism in our country. And so what you can do is use your influence, use your gifts where you are, where you work. the boards that you sit on, the power that you have to identify and to change those systems. And that's why I feel when you're talking about, walking away from the guy who calls out the Black people that messed up his car, I would argue in that moment, that was probably the smartest thing to do, because, it's a negative situation. They're upset. And is that really going to change? I'm not looking for the low-hanging fruit. I'm not trying to find every racist in this country and shake them and say, stop being a racist. I don't care if people stop being racist. I'm trying to stop the systems that are more likely to kill Black people when they are confronted by the police, the systems that make it more difficult for Black-owned businesses to get those PPP funds that were available during the Corona pandemic. All of those systems, all of that stuff. The fact that only 10 Black people have ever been elected to the U.S. Senate in the history of the U.S. Senate. Those are all issues. Those are all problems. And so when, it's really hard sometimes when you see something racist on Facebook, you want to lash out at it. But in the little bit of energy that I have, I'm trying to make bigger change than just the little that made me feel good to slap them virtually, when really that's not changing anything. So we got some stuff in the chat, and so let's see here. There was one thing that I did want to break up. I kind of addressed it a little bit in the chat, but Amelia talked about race as, of course, a social construct. That there's that race, we're all biologically the same, but we still talk about what it means to identify as male or to be labeled as a male because it's important for understanding the impact of gender. But the question she asked, I'm sorry, that was the wrong response. The question she asked is, I think we need a language shift, as has been done around gender issues, not referring to all people as male, for example. What do you think? What do we think about, since we know that race is a social construct, how do we get out of the pattern? How do we get out of these things that we have constructed? That's what our country has done. Any of our panelists?
If I could jump in on that
Awesome.
one. How do we get out of this is a big question. But, first thing we need to do is start, at least as white people, start seeing these racialized structures and these racialized systems. So we have to unlearn these sort of blind spots and this not seeing race, but also seeing it denaturalize it. Race has become naturalized and biologicalized. And so I try to use the language of talking about racialized identity to remind myself and others that this is a social construct, that these constructs are invented. And I think until we start to see race, one of the things you started off a minute ago saying, what can white people do? That's a key question. And one thing that I really try to practice, and it's an ongoing practice, sometimes I do it better than other times, is just, if I'm in a room, whatever circumstance I'm in, start to see how race and power are shaping the room and the dynamics, and who's there and who's not, who's speaking, who's not, how is what I'm saying being heard, and so on. Just start to learn to see race, I think, is really the most crucial step that needs to be taken.
Awesome. I'm going to say that question was answered, because we have a lot of good questions and I want to get to as many of them as we can. And so this next one is from a Black woman who asked our facilitators, why would you continue the charge and the goal of anti-racist? What do you see as the benefit as I believe people of color need to know that you believe this mission and output to raise and elevate all humanity to be treated equal and fair? That's a really good question. So
I'd love to start with that one. I was just talking about this to someone the other day. There's a social media post going around right now that says, check on your white friends. It references, the so many calls to check on your black friends the last several weeks and see how people are doing, and naming that white folks better be having a mental health crisis right now too. And in this post, it talks about, the social media post, it talks about, and I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the author. It talks about seeing images of violence, and don't you see yourself, white person, in that person who's perpetrating the violence? And doesn't that traumatize you? Doesn't that harm you? And my answer to the question is to take that another layer deeper. Like, yes, it does. And yes, it is traumatic and harmful. And also, this is spiritual work for me. I know that I have been socialized to see Black and Indigenous and other people of color as less than human, but on a spiritual level, we are human. And so that socialization has robbed me of my humanity. And so when I see someone die, I see a human die. I am not saying that I do not see their race, but the loss and the trauma that is inflicted upon people of many different identities is a trauma that I share, whether it's because my ancestors were the perpetrators of it or I have a shared empathic human feeling of it. But it's a spiritual thing. I think that we are all robbed of our humanity for as long as we continue to allow this system of oppression and marginalization and violence to continue.
awesome.
I just add, and Kate talked about the experience of empathy, but then going past that and thinking about the spiritual aspect and limitations on our own humanity when we are born into a system of oppression, as white people. I would just add, thinking about things on a societal level, the damage that oppression does to us as a society. And so earlier today, I mentioned I was giving a talk on university and academia, and just a really quick summary, the idea that we make decisions and value judgments about what knowledge is important all the time, and who gets to contribute to our academic knowledge, and who has access to the knowledge that we produce as universities and researchers, and what do we teach as professors, and what's in our textbooks, and what perspectives are in our textbooks, and what perspectives are we bringing in the classroom. We make all these value judgments all the time about what is most important. And of course, all of that then gets translated into policies and systems and structures. And that's the power of knowledge, right? And medicine and whatever the system is. So the fact that our process of generating knowledge in academia and universities is racist and oppressive in intersectional ways limits our progress as a human race in a really meaningful, tangible way. So we all miss out in a racist society. I was in a workshop, and the workshop director said, we're all in the same sinking ship. Some people are down here, some people are up here, but we're all kind of going down together. And I just think that's really true when you think about things on a societal level. And yeah, thanks. It's such an important question.
Awesome. I have a question for all the panelists, because you all have children. And there's a nice little range of ages. And one of the questions was, how do I engage with other people, with people of color, and how do I get my 6-year-old to engage with people of color? And that's something that we bring up in all these sessions too. So how do you do that, parents? How do you make sure that your children are around other people that don't just look like them all the time?
Well, I mean, it's important to model what we're talking about. So I need, I do have a diverse set of friends and colleagues that I work with, and my daughter needs to see that. But it's not just about having Black friends, right? It's about talking to her about this system of race, right? By the time kids are like 4, the research shows, right, they're already developing a sense. Now, they don't have the concepts and the terminology to talk about it, but they have a sense of how this system works and who's privileged and who's not in this racialized system. And so, people often think it's far too young to start talking to kids about this at 5 and 6, but it's not, right? And so I do this work, so I'm always talking about it at home, whether it's to her or she just hears me talking about it when I'm watching TV. And so I think that's valuable. And, I'm very intentional at talking to her about the Black experience, giving her materials and books and movies and so on, because I think that's a key way to decenter her white perspective, right? To start to understand, how is this Black experience different than mine? And I think that's a key aspect of learning.
Anybody else? It's cool if you don't have anything.
Yeah. Right. I have a 4-year-old and a 5-month-old. So this is something that we talk about a lot. And so it's just making decisions. And we're learning too. Somebody posted something recently, a good friend of mine, about inclusive parenting versus anti-racist parenting, and just showing and exposing your kid to diversity as opposed to talking with your kids about racism, and the difference there, and different books and whatnot that you can get into. I mean, we decided to move to Pleasant Ridge, and we're committed to Pleasant Ridge Montessori School, which is a diverse school. We started going to church at St. Peter's University, at St. Peter's. So, there are real decisions you can make.
I think another layer, just ditto to everything everyone has already said, but then there's a follow-up question in the chat that says, how do I know that I'm not intruding on a space that is a safe space because it's identity specific? I mean, if you look at stuff that's publicized online, events, things like that, it'll say who it's for. If it says Black only, don't go. Otherwise, and Derek said this last time, or maybe the time before, go to Black stores, Black events, Black restaurants, Black whatever. People are extremely welcoming. It is not hard to find, assuming that you live in a city. If you live in Cincinnati and your kid goes to Cincinnati public schools, they already have plenty of relationships with Black kids and some other kids of color. And so these conversations about talking about race are more important. But the other layer is you also can immerse yourself in a culture that is not your own without being out of your house. You can consume media, and I'm not just talking about books that have brown kids in them. I mean, watch television shows that are Black shows, listen to podcasts by Black podcasters, read Black authors, and not just the racial scholar ones. Just immerse yourself and experience another person's culture until it becomes as normative as your own. And then you won't feel so afraid of stepping into an environment where you realize you're the only white person. And stop worrying about it. Just do it. And if someone tells you did it wrong, you'll be okay.
Absolutely. Find the things that you like to do and figure out where other people who don't look like you are doing it, and do it there. Do it with them. We have there's people giving lots of good ideas and some quotes and feedback in there. There was a question specifically for David. Please discuss seeing people as individual versus as a group. Like you said, when you came late to a meeting. So individuals start fires at protest.
So in our racial discourse, the way we talk and think about race, it's common for white people to be individualized, right? And to be seen not as a member of a white racial group. This is why we're not often, our racial identity is often not identified in everyday conversation, but we'll identify the Black person's racial identity in the conversation when we want to note it. Yeah, as in Phil's example with the car accident, I think, you know, that's part of that identification. The race, the Black racial identity is the first thing we see, and the person gets reduced from an individual to this member of a racialized group. And so, and white people aren't seen as members of a white racialized group typically. We're just seen as particular individuals. So I can get really angry, and people won't stereotype me as an angry, you know, just another angry white man, as if that's a stereotype. The stereotype is angry Black man, right? And so, or I can show up late to a meeting, and people don't say, "Oh yeah, white people are always late to meetings," right? And I show up late all the time to meetings. It's common, but nobody ever attributes it to my racial identity.
Absolutely. I also think it's really, really important for us to build true and genuine relationships. One of the first things that someone says when they are not racist is, "I have Black friends," right? And we had an incident once where someone was giving us her not racist rant. And it was, you know, her housekeeper growing up let her ride on her back. And she was like a member of the family. And so to push back, I would say, okay, she was like a member of your family. Did she eat at the table with your family? Did you know her last name? Did you know where she lived? Did you know her children's name, her husband's name? Did you go to her house for social functions? Because again, it comes back to that whole triggers of, as long as she's the housekeeper, coming to your house, serving you, letting you out on her back. Because let me tell you, if we growing up in my family had a Black housekeeper, my mother would never, Black, white, or otherwise, allow me to ride on the housekeeper's back while she scrubbed the floors. And so when Kate talks about that, seeing human, when people ask what's different now, people outside of the Black community watch George Floyd for 8.5 minutes flat on his face with someone on his back or someone on his neck. And they didn't say, "Oh man, that's a terrible situation." They looked at him and said, "That is a human. That is my neighbor. That is my brother. That is my friend." And that's the difference. People all over the world are saying that could have been my loved one. That could have been me. And it's not about his color. It's about his humanity. Unfortunately, there are people and there are powers in this world. If you're a Black, you are 6.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than your white counterpart. That's a problem. And so it's not just a Black problem, it is a human problem. Because when you are a human, it should bother you that some other humans out there are more likely to be killed simply because of the color of their skin, simply because of their gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation. You don't have to you don't have to understand, you don't have to agree with someone else to recognize their humanity. And that's what people are doing. It's all over the world. We're recognizing that a lot of the stuff that we've been taught was bullshit, and we have to call it what it is, and we have to fix it and change it, and it's not right. And that's the difference. People, Black people have been saying this. We've had video for years. It's not just a video thing. How many videos have we seen? But now people are saying, you know what? This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. And something has to change, because George Floyd is my neighbor, is my friend. I'm a big Black man. that could have very easily been me. It could have very easily been my father. It could have very easily been any of us. And it's not about the color. It's that humanity. And we're tired of seeing this happen to our Black brothers and sisters. We're tired. We're sick and tired. Anything else in the chat? I see some really good books. That
suggestions. There's one question that I want to talk about. Do we have time?
Absolutely.
Trying to find it because the wording is important, and I want to be clear. I'm not trying to pick on the wording. I just think the wording illuminates an opportunity here. That's like do versus be thing. So it says, I work as a nurse in the urban clinic and predominantly with Black underserved high-risk women. How can I best show up and work for my patients without being perceived as a white savior? I'm usually able to overcome with time, but I'm often seen as another white medical provider. My answer is, why does it matter how you are perceived or how you are seen? Just be who you are. Treat with authentic care. Aim to form authentic relationships. Like, this is the kind of example where intention does matter. It doesn't matter more than impact, right? We intend to do something good and it has a negative impact. We need to take responsibility for the impact. But also, when we get so hung up in there must be a right way to do this, a way that I can be told or affirmed that I'm doing it right or not doing it wrong or not causing additional harm, we forget to bring our authentic and human intentions to the work, and we miss the natural steps. So observe yourself, observe the reactions people have to you, know that people are not formulas, and so there's not always going to be one way to be or things to do that always work. But let the feedback, whether it's verbal or just the way people respond, be feedback. And don't let it define who you are. Decide who you're going to be in your work and be that person. And I know that's a lot easier for me to say than it is to do. So happy to continue to offer support offline if anyone wants it.
Absolutely. When we talk about relationships, I had an opportunity to do this a presentation for the Hive. If you live in Cincinnati, the Hive is a contemplative space. It's a pretty awesome space. And we had a session last Wednesday, and I brought up Meg, one of my members who's on the call. She came with me to Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I think it was about 2 years ago. And so Meg, she's a older white lady. I'm about the age of a couple years younger than her son. And she did the full Black Thanksgiving. What I mean by full Black Thanksgiving, that's going to somebody's house, eating a full plate, taking a plate home, eating dessert, and then going to someone else's house and doing it all over again. and so going to my family's house and I think in my family's house, you're probably the only white person in the room. You got the kids running around. You got, the food over here, the this over there. And it just seems so natural because we've had this relationship for years when we call each other, when we go out to lunch. And it started with just the first time I met her was when I'm interviewed to be the pastor of the church. But over the years, through very intentional relationship building on Meg's part, she would, every time I would preach at the church before I got the job, she would come up and hold conversation, and we would engage, and eventually I ended up at her house having a meal, and developed a relationship with her husband, and she and her husband, and we go to the museum together, we ride together. It's so natural. It's really hard for adults to make friends anyway. And so when you add the race piece, it can seem a little difficult, but it's amazing. It's amazing how just showing up and holding a conversation and expressing your interest and, hey, here's a book I think you might like. Hey, here's an article that I think you may find beneficial. It really is like when we were younger. You just cultivate those relationships. And then next thing you know, they grow. And when you get invited to the family meal, you're in there, right? And so that's my encouragement. It's just for you to continue to cultivate relationships, continue to build. I know it's difficult now with COVID, but there's Black people doing stuff on Zoom. It's on Eventbrite. There's on Facebook. There's brown stuff, and you just show up, and it's amazing. We are so interested in showing who we are and the pride in ourselves. I hate when people tell me they don't see color, because I'm so proud of being Black. I'm so proud of my family. My great grandmother is one of 10, and she was born in 1910, and she and 9 of her siblings, well, she and 8 of her siblings were college graduates, all born in the early 1900s in Kentucky. That's huge. That's huge in any race. And so I take pride that this Black family from Kentucky, that blood pumps through my veins. And so I'm proud of my Blackness. I'll share it, I'll show it. And if you show up, don't give me an interview, but if you give me the opportunity to build relationship, you'll learn that plus more. We are going to do a part 2 of this white fragility. I'm hoping that the panelists will participate in part 2, because several people have asked me privately, and some people who couldn't be on. So we're definitely going to do that. Thank you all so much for participating. If you want to save the chat, Kate, can you tell us? I always forget.
Yep. So if you're on a computer, this doesn't work on tablet or phone app. There are 3 buttons in the bottom right-hand corner of the chat. If you click on it, it gives you a menu, and you can choose Save Chat from there, and then it'll give you an option to show where it's saved on your computer. And if you're on your phone or mobile app and you want a copy of the chat but can't save it, you can message me your email, and I will send it after the Zoom. And again, I will actually do it this time. I promised once, and then I forgot to save it myself.
I've also put my social media in the chat, so you can save that if you want to follow me on social media. I'm pretty dope usually. I've also put the YouTube link for today's session, so you can take a look at that. And then our St. Peter's Facebook page. Sometimes people ask about donations because we are a little broke church. We get way more people on these sessions than we'd have in church. But you can follow us, and feel free if you have a group, or something that you have some people that you're looking for some type of conversation like this. I'm always intrigued and interested in building coalition. And so, yeah, thank you all so much for participating and for coming. And thank our presenters. Yay! Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, David. And thank you all for showing up. Yeah, I think we're done. We'll give you a few minutes to save the chat.
All right.